For more on this, joining us live is Mr Mashni, the Palestinian, Australian and APAN Vice President. Appreciate your time. We heard Dave Sharma's view there. Obviously, he's coming to this from one side of the fence, and we can all understand that this is a very complex, divisive conflict. What's your take on what sparked this latest conflict? Who's to blame here? We've seen overnight the US similarly pointing the finger squarely at Hamas, which it describes as terrorists.
Well, thanks so much, Ash, for the opportunity to be here. I think we need to create some context around where we're at and how we got here. The reality is something like about 3 weeks ago, during the holiest month for Palestinians, or for Muslims, Ramadan, the public space in front of the Damascus gates was closed off. Palestinians led a largely civil protest movement against that blocking of that space. The Israeli police revoked those barriers and the Palestinians were able to access that space. Not long after that, Palestinians within East Jerusalem, now occupied East Jerusalem, Australia recognises East Jerusalem as Palestine, occupied Palestine. The Israelis, using Israeli civil and administrative law, were looking to expel Palestinians from there. The next trigger in this conflagration was the storming of the Al-Aqsa mosque during prayers while Palestinians were laying prostrate praying. Now the reality is those dominos created an effect where Palestinians said no more. Now, fact is, today is Ramadan, it's Eid for us Muslims, it's Christmas Day for us. I'd really like to be celebrating with my parents, my family, enjoying opening up Christmas as most Australians do around Christmas time. But that's denied to Palestinians today within Palestine, but also around the rest of the world.
What would a possible ground invasion mean for the people of Gaza? Do you fear that that is now a likely outcome?
I'm very worried about it being an outcome. One of the challenges with Gaza is the most densely populated place on earth. 2 million people in 365 square kilometres. To give you some idea of what that means, if we had the population density of Gaza in Australia, Australia's population would be 42 billion people. 42 billion people. 50% of that population is under 18. 50% of them refugees, ethnically cleansed, that's driven off their homelands, and they're within a day's walk of their ancestral homelands within Israel proper. Something that is rarely mentioned is the fact is that the State of Israel was created on the ashes of Palestine. That's the root problem here.
Do you have any confidence that the decision by the US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, to dispatch this senior official to Israel will actually encourage mediation efforts? Do you think that that will help at all?
Well, Ash, I'm hopeful and optimistic, and certainly I deplore violence on any side. The death and destruction is just terrible and so heartbreaking for everyone on the ground. The fact is that Israel hasn't abided by any UN resolutions for so long. We've had the Quartet, we've had Oslo, the famous handshake on the White House lawns. That was 28 years ago. Palestinians were supposed to get self-determination and a state 29 years ago. What we have now, and this is one of the challenges that's often missed. I'm an Australian-born Palestinian person. My father came to Australia in the 50s as a stateless person, was given refuge by Australia. I was born here, live a great life, my kids go to school, we've got no COVID. Life's good for a Palestinian Australian. When my father passed away, I endeavoured to repatriate his body and bury him next to his father and mother in his ancestral land in Jerusalem. Josh Frydenberg, our treasurer, is also the child of a stateless refugee. He's an Australian, as am I, celebrates God on Saturday as opposed to me on Friday as a Jewish person and as a Muslim person. Josh, if he chose to, I'm not saying that he might, but if he chose to, could go to Israel, perform Aliyah and take up Israeli citizenship and immediately enjoy all the benefits of what a Jewish person can enjoy within the Jewish democracy. This is one of the structural problems that exists for Palestinians, for the 50% of the people that Israel controls. 50% of the people Israel controls, their lives, are not Jewish. There are elements of structural control that force us to say enough. And what we've seen now, whether it's in Gaza, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and inside Israel proper, is Palestinians, largely led by youth, largely non-violent, saying enough. One of the things I noticed earlier on in your report was your Israeli reporter talked about 2 lynchings. And it's true, an Israeli mob lynched an Arab Palestinian man, a citizen of the State of Israel. And the other lynching, which she neglected to mention, that the Jewish man that was lynched was also lynched by a Jewish mob because he looked Arab. He looked Arab. That's one of the challenges we're facing, Ash.
Mr Mashni, I don't need to tell you that passions run very deep on both sides of the debate when it comes to this conflict. I'm sure there are people sitting at home shouting at the television now, listening to you explaining your side of this. Do you feel that the Palestinian side of the argument gets a fair hearing from the Australian government?
Look, it certainly doesn't. And it's a reality that we're underrepresented, whether it be in the media or in Parliament. And the fact is, we're in a democracy and we're entitled to and allowed to lobby. And the fact is, the Israel lobby does a fantastic job. The Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, we're endeavouring to replicate that, but we don't have the same level of resources. One thing that's our polling has suggested is increasingly Australians are seeing the just rights of the Palestinians to justice, self-determination, the right to live and breathe. And if you're a Gazan inside Gaza now, 14 years you've lived under a cruel military siege. And we should put siege in the context of, Game of Thrones, of that medieval concept, denying food, water, etc. If you're a Palestinian in Gaza, the Israelis determine when the power is on, when the electricity is on, when the water comes in, how much food comes in, whether you can leave or stay. Palestinians in Gaza use the Israeli shekel.
Mr Mashni, none of us like to see the violence in the Middle East, and obviously it's difficult for you watching on from here at home. We appreciate you joining us to give us your reaction today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ashley.
And as I mentioned, it is so complex, and we will here at Sky News endeavour to continue to bring you all sides of what is a deep running argument.